I want to thank you guys for having me tonight. You guys are a little bit of a different group than I'm used to talking in front of. So when time allows, I definitely want you guys to stop me and ask questions. I'll try to manage time best we can because, I imagine that there'll be parts where I might have to move you guys on. But thank you all for coming out. What I want to do tonight is I want to talk about some of the work that I've been doing over at Children's Hospital Boston. Actually, now we're Boston Children's Hospital. I'm not used to saying that yet. But over at Boston Children's Hospital, where we've been designing new video games and new toys to help kids who are emotionally dysregulated. I've had the fortune to work with 3 wonderful colleagues as I've done this. So myself up on the upper left over there. Peter Ducharme is a clinical social worker. He's helped us a lot. I'm going to talk about the studies that we've been doing. He's been doing a ton of work on that. And Joe Gonzalez and Alex Rottenberg are 2 senior people. Joe Gonzalez is a psychiatrist. Alex is a neurologist. And really their guidance on this project and helping us define what we're doing and help us ideate and help us figure out how we're reaching these kids has been incredibly invaluable. I think off the bat, one of the things I've learned most about doing this work has been the value in getting like a ton of expertise available right off the bat, and really like having a breadth of expertise in working with kids. As Todd said, my background, I graduated from Tufts with a degree in human factors. And then after that, I went back to school and got a PhD in education. I spent a lot of time focusing on how kids basically acquire cognitive skills, learn to take in new techniques, and really how they use representations within their mind to build new ideas. And hopefully you'll see how that thinking informed us as I go forward in this presentation. All right, so I'm used to giving academic talks. You always start academic talks with disclosures. I'm going to talk about a lot of ideas on this slide. Joe Gonzalez takes in a lot of money from pharma. It's not really a conflict in this case because, as you'll see, a lot of the ideas have implication in reducing needs on pharma. So, but what is there? Outline slide is more there for myself, so I actually structure a talk and keep to a plan. First thing I want to talk to you guys about is emotional regulation and dysregulation, and really set the background for how we came up with this idea and what problems we were observing as we developed our thinking. We had a very clear picture of what ideal was. You can search in literature anywhere, and you can come up with these stories of people who are always calm under pressure. They always keep their cool, no matter what's going on around them. I chose the man with no name because I just sort of love the image. Like no matter what's going on around him, he's there. He doesn't zone out. He doesn't pull back. He's always really focused and always ready for action. Despite that, he's always able to keep his wits about him. He doesn't get overwhelmed by the situation, but his calmness doesn't preclude him from action. He's always right there with it. This is not a skill we see in really anybody. I mean, the fictional characters, you never see them in anything. You guys can substitute your own favorite fictional character in here. So you guys can be Jedi or James Bond or I'm really right now into Justified. So if you want to be Raylan Givens, go for it. But I think that there are these characters that we all can see that are always able to keep their wits about them and stay calm and focused and attentive all at the same time. We know that's not the reality for anyone, and we know for a certain group of kids, it's nowhere close to the reality. So, getting back to where kids start developmentally, we know for really little kids, we expect a range of emotional responses from these kids. Learning to control your emotional response and learning emotional response, that's a learned skill. I don't know if any of you guys have had the joy of hanging out with a 2-year-old, but we don't expect much of them when it comes to an emotional response. A 10-year-old is a completely different matter. We expect that a 10-year-old be able to rein in their impulses. And adults, we expect all of you guys not to go around hitting people. I don't know how your day at work was today. Hopefully you guys are doing all right. But we do expect you guys not to go around whacking people just as sort of whatever your impulses are. The skill doesn't always develop for all these kids. And when this doesn't happen, it has really negative consequences for these kids. If you can't interact positively with your family, then it puts a lot of stress on the family environment. That typically spills over into school and relationships with your peers. You end up, at best, just sort of withdrawn from the school environment, but you also might end up acting out, getting called out of classrooms. You're going to end up farther behind academically, and people have spent a lot of time looking at this negative feedback loop, this just reinforcement of getting pulled farther and farther back. One of the things that is really common in psych units is that you see a lot of the kids that are showing up in your unit are for these anger, aggression, anxiety. It's all a similar pathway in the brain. And these are the majority of the kids that are coming in to see us. And we wanted to do something about that, obviously, and we were thinking about these kids quite a bit as we developed our solution. This slide is really an excuse for me to put in my own kid. But, one of the things that we know, like absolutely for certain, is that earlier you can intervene with these kids, the better off they are. You're breaking the cycle, you're interrupting the loop, and you're giving them a way out and new tools to help them cope with the stress that they're seeing. We know also from the research that you can build these skills, you can train them. It's just in the past it's been really, really hard. So if you guys go in today to see a mental health professional, you're going to get one of two, for anger and aggression issues, you're going to get one of two approaches to help you guys out. The first is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is evidence-based and works really, really well for adults. There is lots of evidence that you guys can spend time reading about how cognitive behavioral therapy can help adults with a whole host of problems. It involves basically using your brain, you're using your cognition, to reframe the troubling thoughts that you guys are seeing and process them in a more healthy way. For kids who are emotionally dysregulated, these kids tend to be boys, they tend to be early adolescents, and they tend to not have a ton of prefrontal cortex, that part that actually does the thinking. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a tough sell with this group. So with enough sessions and enough time, you can usually make some progress, but it's really, really hard. Your other option is to give kids meds. Psych meds have a lot, there's a lot of politics behind psych meds. The bottom line on psych meds is that they do their job. A lot of people are prescribed psych meds and a lot of people are helped out with psych meds, but this efficacy usually comes at a cost, especially with meds in the antipsychotic class. They have a lot of weight gain, there's a lot of weight gain associated with these kids, so yes, a parent can choose to prescribe these drugs to their kids if it's going to make their kids fat. You can also, you're also withdrawing the kid. You're making them less engaged. I mean, that's what the drug is supposed to do. It's inhibiting those neurotransmitters, and it's going to pull the kid back. Again, the drug is doing their job, but you're always making that devil's bargain when you go to the drugs. So that's sort of the scope of the problem. What I want to do next is I want to back up so I can talk to you guys about how we came up with our ideas of our solution. I want to back up and talk about the underlying neurology. So the first thing when we think about the neurology, we always think about the external stimulus, the thing that's going to stress you out. So the next thing that happens in the brain is it goes to the thalamus, which is, it's sitting at the top of the brain stem. It's this piece of the brain that's basically your command center. The thalamus is going to shift off the responses needed. This is something stressful, something engaging. First thing that's going to happen is it's going to recruit the amygdala. Amygdala are there are two of them. They're these little tiny walnut-sized things in your brain, but they are responsible for your emotional processing. And if nothing moderates the amygdala, you are going to have a flight or flight response. That basically means this thing is stressful. You are either going to withdraw or you're going to hit it. And it's going to be, some variation of one of those two things. And that is typically not a good thing. So this pathway happens to work very fast in the brain. It's a basic survival thing. The fact that this pathway is fast allows you to survive. It's a very good thing. When we're talking about the drawbacks here, there's a lot of good from being able to react to something that you need to react to very, very, very fast. The brain has a second option, though, and it can recruit another part of the brain. So the thalamus can, in response to the stimulus, it still recruits the amygdala, but it can also send off a signal to the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex can act as a brake. And this connectivity happens to be vital when we look at how kids react to their stimulus. So, you know, if you have both the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex working in tandem, you're going to get these nice, fast, but potentially measured responses. This is the most neuroscience I'm going to talk. Am I doing okay with you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I want to boil all that down into a couple insights. And really the first thing is, and it should be obvious, but just to be really, really clear, emotional arousal happens in demanding situations. Your amygdala is not going to fire sitting in an office practicing relaxation skills. And therefore, children are not going to learn to balance that connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex sitting practicing only relaxation skills. There needs to be some sort of cognitive demand. Otherwise, you're going to have this skill. Yes, kids are going to be very good at relaxing, but it's not going to be something that they can pull in and recruit when they need it. And you know, they don't need it when they're in a nice, relaxing, peaceful situation with nice music and nice lighting and all that. They need it when the teacher is asking them for something or someone's up in their face. And the second insight, which is a little more subtle, is that there's a balance between the two systems in your brain. We don't want kids who can only relax. We don't want kids who can only flip out in demanding situations. You want to be able to do both at the same time. You want to be able to find that balance. You want to be able to respond to the demands that are in front of you in a really immediate way, but in a way that's measured, that takes into account all your options. Sort of made this slide to reinforce this balancing act. But you know, the amygdala, which is really, it's a very basal part of your brain. So the basal part of your brain, yes, it's going to trigger this flight or flight response. It's going to trigger this really, this really unmeasured response that really has nothing to do with processing the pros and cons of a situation. But it's going to focus you, and it's going to happen, and you're going to make a decision really, really fast. And that's a good thing. The prefrontal cortex is a slower system. If you really only rely on that, you're going to withdraw from the situation, and you're not necessarily going to respond in a way that's appropriate. But at the same time, you're going to make a measured decision. You're going to see all the options in front of you, and you're going to engage appropriately with everybody around you. And sort of importantly for where I'm going with all this, there is certain physiology associated with both the basal and the more higher order cognitive functions, and they mirror each other, which is really convenient. You guys are all familiar with the amygdala response or the basal response. I mean, you guys can feel it. Your heart rate goes up, so if you guys were measuring my heart rate right now, you'd see something pretty high. Your respiration goes up, your muscles get all tense, you start to sweat. These are the types of things. And as you become more relaxed, the exact opposite happens. So that's sort of the background of the neurology of what's going on. So that gives a context for when a kid shows up in a psychiatrist or any mental health provider's office, and he gets a little angry, and mom gets a little angry, and the kid doesn't have a right response. So the kid gets a little angrier. The kid learned this response from someone, so that someone is mom. Mom gets a little angrier, kid gets angrier, mom gets angrier, so on, so on, so on. That's what's going on in their brain. We have a pretty good idea from the literature what the neurology is. And in fact, that exact situation is what led Joe Gonzalez and I, we were having a conversation in his office when we started coming up with our therapeutic interventions. That exact situation of kid, mom, kid, mom, kid, mom, like this unchecked, like shared neurological response. The next thing we had to do is we had to figure out, well, how do kids actually learn? Like, what do we have to put in front of kids in order to get them to learn new things? It's one of the things that is really vitally important when you ask a kid to learn something new is that you have to keep in mind, for a child, for everyone, but for a child especially, learning is exploration. You can't tell a kid something and expect that they learn it. You can't tell a kid to relax. You can't tell a kid to take deep breaths. You can't tell them, all right, I want you to stretch here and lay all your muscles out. It will not work. They have to engage with the situation, and they have to explore it, and they have to feel it for themselves. The graphic I put up there is one of my favorite. This is just an example of how when you tell kids something, what you tell them and how they interpret it is like vastly different things. It's very common to ask kids, like we tell kids that the earth is round all the time, right? So this is a drawing, this is actually a very common drawing of a kid drawing a round earth. Kids draw these snow globe representations all the time because they hear things from adults, but they don't know how to process it. They're trying to fit it in with their experiences. And this is a fairly general phenomenon. So when we tell kids something, they're going to try to internalize it best they can, but they're going to put it in with the experiences that they already have. Kids don't see a round earth. They can't process the sphere. So they're going to make a round earth, but they're going to make it in terms that make sense to them. So the second point I want to make on learning, and then finally we'll actually get to talk about what we're actually doing, is that learning is iteration and improvisation. So learning is always going to depend on what came before, what has worked before, and what the stimulus is. So again, let's tie it back to the kids who are trying to relax. If a certain unchecked response has gotten them what they want before, then they are going to repeat that skill, and they might put a little twist on it, but they're going to keep repeating that skill, and it's going to keep getting them what they want. So just asking them to do something different, it's not going to happen. That pathway in the brain is just going to get reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. However, at the same time, the brain is, as the brain does this iterative process, the brain is also a good one for improvisation. It will make small changes as time, and it will see what works and what doesn't work. And you can see this when you watch little kids do certain tasks. They'll make very subtle changes each time, and they might stumble on something that's even more reinforcing each time. Subtle changes are actually not the only pathway. Actually, every now and then, the brain makes these huge, massive, huge schematic changes, which is when developmental changes were, when levels were changed, we were talking about the chi bits. That's actually a huge, complete shift in how the brain likes to think. The brain has both an incremental and a completely radical way of changing. The picture here is actually from some of the earlier work I've done, but I was asking kids to just show me a moving car over and over again. And this is, the kid basically, without any instruction, just basically stumbled on these sets of representations that at first were really, really vague. But as he could see what was communicating and what was not communicating, over the course, no instruction, absolutely zero instruction, just seeing what works and doesn't work. He ends up at a place where, he has a system for showing how fast the car is moving by the number of lines. He has a system for showing what direction it's moving by very clearly labeling himself. This kid was named Duncan. And just building on a system over and over and over again. So that gets us to really the wrap-up of just attending to how kids learn, which is, when we ask a kid to learn, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to build a space where they get constant feedback to play with their ideas. And they get to see how their ideas are going, and they get to make changes to those ideas as needed. And the space, in my mind, the space really needs to be very constrained specifically on the skills that you want to teach the child. Because if the space is too broad, they're gonna learn. I mean, kids are built to learn, but they might not be learning the skills that you want them to learn. All right. So that said, we worked from, working from the neurology, working from the learning theory, we started thinking specifically about this kid and this mom, and what can we do to help this kid and this mom. And we ended up designing a video game. So if we were to plop you guys, I'm going to break this down in a second, but if we were to plop you guys in front of our video game, this is what it would look like. You'll notice that us being researchers, we're very crude in our graphics and our presentation. That said, there is quite a bit of room of improvement for how we provide feedback to the kids, and I actually will talk about that as time goes on. But this is the first version of what we put in front of kids, and it's a Space Invaders clone. Let's take back. Has everybody here played video games before? There's some no's, seriously. So Has everyone here played Space Invaders before? Okay, getting a few maybes. So Space Invaders is a very basic game. There are, you're not going to believe this, but there are invaders from space, and they're attacking you from the top of the screen. They fly down. And the classic Space Invaders, they move across the screen, they slowly creep towards you. You're a little ship, you're fixed to the bottom of the screen. You can only go back and forth, and you can only shoot at the guys. That's it. That's the extent of the game mechanic. And it's a really powerful game mechanic because it's been around for about 30 years, and people are not bored of it yet. If you just like Google for a Flash Space Invaders clone, you will be able to find many, and you will be able to kill a good half hour tomorrow playing this game, or tonight. If you're bored right now, go for it. So, yeah, it's a very classic mechanic. We made two really important changes to this mechanic for building this game in order to structure how we wanted these kids to interact. First thing we did. So we have the player who scrolls around the bottom of the screen, and he can shoot. And we have the enemies, these little ghost-looking things. We have them. So there's our Space Invaders mechanic. All right, so what we did after that is we added in friends. And friends serve a really important purpose in our case. So if you can just drive around and shoot at things, then your brain is not being asked to do a whole lot of work. It's basically just slamming on a key. There's no inhibition. There's no anything. You're just sort of like, you just sort of play in the game. You're shooting at things. You're not doing much cognitive work in this scheme of things. But we can do something to change that. We can add in a stimulus of a friend. And what this does, and this is actually really well understood, is the second a friend is there, you're asking someone to make decisions. And the second you're asking someone to make decisions, you're recruiting the prefrontal cortex. And the second you're recruiting the prefrontal cortex, you're starting that balancing act that we talked about in the beginning. So now you have this time-sensitive pressure. I've got to find the bad guys. I got to find the bad guys. I got to shoot them down. You got to do it fast because they're coming down. And unlike the Space Invaders, where they're slowly wandering side to side, our bad guys go straight down. Got to do this fast. Meantime, there are these friends. Don't want to shoot the friends because you'll lose points. And if you're a kid, that's in itself plenty of motivation. If you're an adult, I play video games. I care about how much points I get. But if you're, this in itself is plenty of motivation for the kids. Okay, that's change number one. That's actually not our most interesting change. Our second change was to start to use the kid's emotion as an input. So, remember how, again, I talked about how amygdala response raises heart rate. Well, lots of things raise heart rate, but if you're sitting down playing a video game, the only thing that's raising your heart rate is your emotional arousal. That's the only thing that's going to raise. There are other things that could be going around, but it's that part of your nervous system, that part of your brain. If your heart rate's moving around, it's because that part of your brain is being recruited. For some reason, whether it's the game or not, something is recruiting that part of your brain. So we use this as an input, and we change the behavior of the game based on what the kid is doing. So if they're sitting under some threshold that we define at the beginning of the game, and the way we define that threshold is, this is really high tech. We set the kid down and we measure their heart rate at the beginning of the game. If you stay under that threshold, then you can fire your gun. If you go over that threshold, you can't fire that gun. Which basically means if you are emotionally reacting for some reason, we put you in a more stressful situation because now the aliens are getting past, you're losing points, bad things are happening. And while all these bad things are happening, you've got to find a strategy that's going to pull you back under that threshold. So rather than, a lot of people, one of the key innovations here, at least from our perspective, is that, in a lot of games, the focus is, this adaptive difficulty. Like make the game, if the kid is not good at the game, make the game easier. Our belief is, based on what we're trying to teach the kid, if the kid is struggling at the game, make it harder. And really force them to come up with a strategy that is going to bring them back into a place where they can succeed in the game. Questions? You guys okay? Go for it.
About this
Yeah, we do. That's a great question. You want to give them a seed of what will work and what won't work. For the microphone's sake, the question was, do we tell them what we're doing? We give them we tell them vaguely how the game will work, so they know that they have to stay calm in order to be able to shoot. We also give them a seed of a strategy of what will work and what won't. Like we tell them, like a lot of people succeed when they take big breaths while they play the game. That doesn't mean they're going to take big breaths while they play the game. It's just a hint of what a strategy might be.
What ages?
We've done this with ages 10 to 18, and I'm working right now with younger kids, so 6 and up.
Yeah, I had a question. Normally I find myself when I get like really tense during a game or something, that's almost when I'm having more fun. Or if I reach that peak where I'm over that, then I just want to throw the remote against the wall.
Yeah, we want to stop that.
What is the typical response of them? Do some get so angry or so frustrated that they just can't get calmed down?
That's a good question. I think that one of our strengths in this case is how simple our game is. I think that we've been doing this game thus far. We've been doing it with a therapist, with them, and we haven't sent the kids home alone. Like we're starting to have kids play the game alone. It's not research I'm ready to talk about yet, but we're just starting on down that path. When we sit a kid in front of our game, the typical response is, we measure their heart rate at the beginning. The second they start playing their game, universally, the kid's heart rate goes up. These kids are pretty emotionally reactive. Those circuits don't work that well as it is. It goes up a lot. Like when we tested it versus like just ourselves as the healthy people versus the kids. Like the kids, it's actually reasonably okay. There's some diagnostic information in there that we haven't validated, but these kids' heart rate goes up a lot. They do have support with them to help them maintain their control. And because the game is so simple, imagine you're thinking about like mission-based type games where you're trying to accomplish some stated goal more than get as much points as possible. We don't have kids failing out of missions repeatedly, for example. I mean, the game goes for its set duration of time, and then after 3 minutes, there's sort of all right, let me think about this and let me go back at it. All right. So the other technology, remember how I said at the beginning that we want to reach kids as early as possible. So the other technology we've been working on is our toys. Our toys allow us, because they're physical, one of the things that we know about really little kids is they really like tangible things. They really like things that they can sort of explore with and play with, and they can see how those behaviors change. So we started building, we call them emotional manipulatives. And I'm going to skip back and forth between slides because the shaking table, which is the one on the right, I have a nice schematic of that thing. But basically, we ask kids in a group to meet some sort of goal-directed activity. So build as big of a tower as you can with your friends. So Todd and I are sitting around, we're building a big tower. If either one of Todd or my heart rate goes up, then what's going to happen is those blocks, or in this case the table, is going to start to shake. And if Todd can't regulate, then the blocks are going to fall over. Now, okay, Todd's already dysregulated. I'm 6. Todd just broke my tower. My inclination is to get pretty mad at Todd. But that's not the terms of success here. What's going to get those blocks shaking, what's going to get us going again, is if I can say, hey, Todd, let's figure this out. Why don't you try taking a deep breath? And we can really start to share our emotional regulation state. It's really big, it's really, really important that we be able to do this together because, well, being able to play in the game is good. I mean, a lot of these kids are going out and we're asking them to interact socially. We're not all about cooperation. The car, which is the guy on the left over there, is a more competitive version of this. So those are remote control cars that I've hacked. As your emotional state goes up, the car slows down. So one of the cool things about emotional reactivity is it doesn't care if you're excited or angry. If I'm like really excited that I'm about to beat Todd in a race, I'm not being a good friend. I'm like kind of, it's not a good skill. My car is going to start freaking out and going out of control and going all over the place. And Todd is going to be able to catch up. I need to be able to keep that even keel. I need to be that man with no name who I showed you at the beginning. But meanwhile, Todd over there, he might be really frustrated that he's losing. That's not a good skill either. His cars also might be freaking out at the same time. So he has to learn, no matter what is going on for him, he needs to be able to keep that car nice and steady. He needs to be able to keep himself nice and steady, and that's how he's going to be competitive. We are working on building these guys right now, and test forthcoming. So, the benefits here, again, I already alluded to these things. We can use these guys with younger kids, which is really important to me. We can also use it with different development. It's not just age development, but like kids with autism or other developmental disorders who are having a hard time connecting with these sort of tangible things could be more valuable. And we can use them in groups. All right. So being an academic, one of the things I do is I study what I come up with. And we have some nice early evidence that what we're doing is actually an effective strategy. So I do want to go through that quickly. And then from there, we can sort of go on to sort of a thing. Although I'm babbling, I'm sorry. So, starting out with the aims, we believed that when we put kids in front of the video game, they were going to build therapeutic skills. They were going to get better at the game, within the game itself, so internal validity, and that they were going to get better at emotional control outside of the game, so external validity. So our first study happened on our inpatient service. It's called an open label trial, and what that means is that everyone in the trial got the intervention. We compared them to kids who received treatment as usual. And we ended up, this nice graphic, it really points to the fact that we ended up with 19 kids who received treatment as usual who were comparable to the 18 kids who gave treatment as usual. The biggest way you could get excluded from our study was to start meds. Being given an antipsychotic has a huge effect and would conflate our results. Hold on, I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Todd's going to bring the mic.
It's a big room.
Thank you, Todd. If you could clarify a little on, you just said you work with children who were on medication.
No, okay. These kids were in our inpatient psychiatry unit. To get on an inpatient psychiatry unit, you have to be pretty sick. These were kids who were so they started out, we found kids who, we screened them for their level of anger that's what that STACI-CA thing stands for. It's basically a psychosocial screen to tell you how angry the kid is. So then at the next level of this little graphic, we have a cutoff score, which is validated as these kids are, essentially, to be very lay about it, these kids are very angry. We did not, if the kid then subsequently, over the course of the next week when we were giving the intervention, they were to receive an antipsychotic medication. An antipsychotic medication is known to reduce a kid's anger level. So we didn't want to include those kids in our results because otherwise, like we would, in both treatment as usual and in our intervention, like those kids would be getting an unfair boost from the result of the antipsychotic. If the kid was on an antipsychotic, but that was before we ever met the kid and they were still showing this huge level of anger and aggression, we kept them in our treatment group. In more jargony, it means they were stable on medication. So basically, we excluded kids from analysis. You were excluded from analysis if your medication dose was changed for some reason.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So, sort of to fly through the design, we measured their symptoms of anger and aggression. About half the kids got intervention. About half the kids had treatment as usual. So that, just a week of treatment in our inpatient unit. And then we collected the measures post. Just so you guys can better understand what we were actually doing with these kids, we actually integrated the game into a cognitive behavioral therapy. This was done, and we address part of what I think is probably one of your concerns later. But this was done because when you're intervening with a group of kids, a group of vulnerable kids, you have to be able to, you have to be able to say what you're giving them has some benefit. And since we do this validated therapy had some benefit, we were allowed to integrate our game into that thing. So they were, over the course of 5 sessions, they got this anger control therapy act, and they also got the video game at the same time. A logical criticism at this point is, well, maybe the anger control therapy did something and we're not accounting for that. We'll account for that in a second. But for our first passive study, we integrated anger control therapy with the video game just to see how these kids did as a first pass. So, most boring result. Kids found our therapy helpful. That was great. Care more about whether they got better. Let's give some qualitative let's give us some qualitative character to what these kids were doing during the video game. So, I think this is going to work. This is the example of, that's the ship firing. That whiff is her missing. And now you can hear her breathing. And now she can fire it. So she whiffs and then she fires again. This process repeats over and over and over again for this girl. How long is this clip? And really what's happening in here is that she's seeing, with her own experience, that her breathing is having a positive effect on what she can do. So you hear the sound of bang, 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 that little chirping sound. That whiff is her firing blanks, these bullets that won't hurt anything. And then she has to learn she has to see that being able to use this therapeutic skill is actually going to help her. And it does help her. And she goes on, over and over again. We often ask kids to describe what they do after they are successful. So you're going to hear my colleague Pete Ducharme asking a girl what she did to help her succeed. She's going to basically say she has no clue.
Something happened towards the end of that game where it started to work out for you. Did you feel that way?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Knows it worked.
Nothing? But something different definitely happened. Did you think so?
Yeah.
So they're feeling like there's a change. These girls, these kids are definitely getting better within the game. They're getting better at emotional control within the game. But it's very, very hard for them to put into words what's going on. And that's consistent with what we were expecting with these kids. You're giving them an environment where they can practice a skill that's really hard to learn, but something where they build up that skill on not necessarily a conscious level, but they can see it working over and over again. We can look at their heart rate throughout the game. So that purple line is the threshold. Your x-axis over here is the time within the game. The game goes for 3 minutes. And your y-axis here is the heart rate. So this is my over-animated slide, but over threshold, you can see it's these blips above threshold. And under threshold, same deal. And we can, very simply, we can do a little integral, figure out, okay, under threshold for 52%, over threshold the rest of the time. So we're interested. That was game number 1. Game number 1 in control half the time. Same subject. Game number 5. So only 5 hours of interacting with our game. Not even 5 hours, but only 5 sessions of therapy. Very different looking graph. And we see that the girl is under for 85% of the time. This is a pattern that repeats a lot. So when we look at all of our kids, we see that these kids are starting out under threshold, around 45% of the time. And as they build up throughout therapy, all of our kids in aggregate are ending up around 70 times. They're building skill within the game, which is really nice. It means they're getting better at emotional control while playing the game. This slide and its little animation sort of highlights what's going on. state anger is how angry are you feeling right now. Trait anger is how often do you feel anger, and is outward expression of anger. This is a very academic slide, but basically what I'm trying to show you here is that you can see very clearly that these kids are feeling angry less often, and they're outwardly expressing their anger less often. Normally in studies you see p-values of 0.05, which would get state anger, but due to the fact that we can't prove that all these things are completely independent, we reduced our threshold to 0.1. So states, if we had more subjects, state would be there. It's not. But we're seeing these basically we're seeing that these kids are getting, their anger is less intense, their anger is less frequent, and they're expressing their anger less often. It's 3 really good things, and it's completely independent of the game.
I just wanted to understand. So you're not just talking about like within the game. You're talking about in their
outside the game, in their environment, how they feel as they interact with the world.
So what I'm curious about is how you get them to make that transference from the game to life. And
so that's a great question, and the answer is right now with the toys we're more explicitly making that connection, but right now we're not. This is the skills that they're building in the game. Appear like the circuits that we're asking them to reinforce appear to be, they appear to be generalizing that without too much of a push on our end.
And another question I have is, so I'm trying to understand what you said about when you asked the girl what she did and she didn't know. But you said it's really the cognitive part of the brain that's regulating emotion. But
that's a great point. Thank you. So the prefrontal cortex is regulating emotion. The prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in cognition, but it's also a brake. It's a dampening. So there are functions of the prefrontal. There's a connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the basal areas of the brain. And the stronger that connectivity, so when you look at how these things are connected, it sort of lives in a life cycle. If there's no connection, then the prefrontal cortex is never going to know that you're angry. It's never going to have a response. Second level, prefrontal cortex are heavily, very, very heavily connected, but the connection is developing. If you look at that, either via an EEG, you're going to see a lot of signal there. MRI, you're going to see even more because you're going to see the blood moving, like the oxygen moving around along that pathway. And that really means that you're exerting some sort of effortful control over that. Third level, that connection recedes into the background because it's so automated that you become very good at doing it. So if I were to look at, if I had an MRI machine right in front of you, I could do an fMRI right now. I'm going to assume, you being a functioning, healthy, happy adult, that if I put you, too many assumptions, I'm going to assume that if I put you in this machine, that you're not going to, if we ask you to do something really challenging and really, we're not going to see a ton there on the connection between, the basal area of your brain and the higher order parts of your brain. That doesn't mean that the connection is poor. That means that that pathway has to exert very, very little energy. You wouldn't know why it was doing that. It just happens. And we seem to be moving kids through this effortful, it's very hypothetical because we don't have enough results to really say this. We don't have kids in MRI machines. We don't, I'm making a lot of assumptions as I say this, but we seem to be moving kids through this phase in a pretty rapid way and getting them to a point where they're at this more automated, like this connection is there and established and available for use. I want to be very, very, I'm going to back up and be a scientist for a second and say I need to be really, really careful as I make that statement because that's a testable hypothesis. I have not tested it yet. And therefore I can't say for sure that's what's happening. But that's my hypothesis of what's going on right now.
So in terms of the results that you're showing here, can you tell us more kind of I know that it's a statistical reduction in anger, but what does that mean in practical terms?
That's a great question. I mean, basically, so this is child self-report. So when we give this measure, we're asking a child, you know, how angry are you? And, you know, I think that, you know, we're saying, so the kids are basically responding to us and saying, you know, I feel, right now, I feel less angry as a person, like just my state anger. Right now, I am less angry. And yes, it's hard to say, okay, the change versus the treatment as usual is negative 0.38. So negative 0.38, how much less angry is that? It's not exactly the easiest to say, but it's a, you know, it's a 10-point scale. So they're using like about 40% of the scale. Each of these is a 10-point scale. The trait anger is actually a bigger scale. It's 15 points, but still, like, you know, half the scale is going away. I mean, it's like, it's pretty nice to see that this is the movement. You know, I don't know if that gives you a little bit of baseline for how much, you know, these kids are moving. And it's self-report. So it's not like, okay, I'm this kid's parents and I'm gonna feel that this kid is less angry. This is a kid saying how much less angry they feel. Okay, go for it.
Did the kids realize that the games were helping them and like ask to play because they realized that their anger was down after they played the game?
We actually didn't ask that. That's a great question. You know, they like playing the game. It's very clear that kids like, I mean, kids like our game. As simple as our game is, kids, you know, the interaction of using your emotional state as an input is novel enough to these kids that I think of it sort of like the Wii effect. You know, you can put subpar graphics in front of a kid as long as the interaction is interesting enough. You know, the kids will lose interest when they master the interaction. Like, I mean, you know, I mean, it's pretty cliche to say that there's a lot of Wii gathering dust. But in our case, if they put our game on the shelf because they've mastered that thing, that's a pretty great thing for us. All right. So remember how I said we were going to deal with the criticism of we're giving all these kids therapy no matter what. That was our second study. So what we did in our second study is we're giving all of our kids a video game to play, and we're giving them all the same therapy. The only difference is that the kids who are getting our sham video game, they play the same video game, heart rate is not an input. Their emotional state is not an input into this game. So they get to play the game, they get to play the same game as everyone else, they get to come to therapy, so they're engaged.
Did they still wear the heart rate monitor?
They still wore the heart rate monitor. So they can just shoot continuously. It never stops. So we have their data of how they control within the game, and we can see how that changes. But the heart rate just is not an input. So we are in the process of turning through the results for this. We've enrolled our last patient, we finished our last patient, and we are about to have results. So we can make a nice table like I showed before. But, you know, we know that we're crossing statistical thresholds on a couple things. So we have a parent report of how the children are doing, and the parents are rating their child as less aggressive. We have a parent self-report of their own stress level. Kids who play the intervention video game, their parents are reporting being less stressed. And we asked their clinicians to rate the symptoms, the severity of the symptoms for the kids. And the clinicians are seeing less severe symptoms. One of the things that's really interesting that I'll share with you guys is the self-report does not have as dramatic of a movement as it did before. That actually has a lot to do with the population, I think. The first group of patients that we actually tested with, a lot of actually the most prevalent diagnosis in that group was eating disorders. Girls with eating disorders tend to be a pretty angry lot as a bunch. And, you know, but they're also very good at self-reflection. Our second group of kids had ADHD. And one of the hallmarks of kids with ADHD is they're not necessarily that great at self-reflection. So that might account for why the self-report isn't changing as much as it did before. Okay. I want to try to distill what I've talked about into a few pearls of wisdom, so forgive me. But one of the things that's been really important for me is that we're starting to see that this emotionally controlled video game does teach regulation. And one of the things that we're pulling from this is, yes, if we pay attention to what's going on in the mind, if we pay attention to how kids actually learn and how they interact with their environment, and we very carefully target what we're doing, that we think that's our recipe for success. And the last thing we're going to add in is we want our kids to have fun so that they come and they're motivated to keep playing. To sort of step back and broaden for a little bit, I've done with this project and the project I was involved with at Tufts before I came to this project, we did a lot with giving kids real-time feedback of what was going on, what the stimulus was, and how that could modulate what they were doing. This ability to have an environment that really channels what the kid sees and really changes based on what the kid is doing in real time is incredibly powerful. Having this constant feedback that changes, it allows the kid to do this iteration and improvisation, which would not be possible. I mean, I think, from the literature, somebody once delayed the feedback just by 15 seconds and showed it to the kid. And a lot of the learning gains just disappeared just in that 15-second window. We really take very seriously that, building on your own experience. We don't tell kids there's one right way to regulate. We let them see what they're doing is working, and we let them improve on it. So really allowing for your learners to take their own experiences and build on those experiences and see what's working. And we really try to stay razor focused in what we allow the kid to do. We want to make sure that our skill allows our environment allows the skill we want to grow and is focused on that one thing. So all that said, we still do have some challenges. Oh, we got a question.
I just had a general question about the concept of learning and transference.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the kids don't really know what they're doing, it sounds like you're opening up a neural pathway so that they can do something, but if they're not aware of that,
Right.
what kind of learning is going on? And have you found that older kids cognitively transfer this and younger kids don't? Or
Okay, that's a great question. I think that, I'm really hearing two questions on there in terms of like, well, how do you know which pathway is going to develop and what's going to allow these kids to learn? And I think that comes from the being hyper-focused about what you allow, like what are your terms of success within your environment and what are your terms of not being successful. So yes, there are, I mean, obviously the brain is like, it's this huge maze of tangle of pathways that and they're all developing at the same time, and sometimes, you've got competing stimulus and competing this and competing that. When we always give kids a seed, we never throw them and say like, here's a game, go play it. We say, in the past, we play this with other kids, and they've done this deep breathing exercise, and this deep breathing exercise has worked. So they always have a seed to start with. And if that seed works, then they have something to build on, and they'll use that deep breathing happened to be a really successful seed for us. To be a little more concrete, within the CBT literature, you're often told to help kids breathe at like what's called a 3-3-6 pattern. So in for 3, hold for 3, out for 6. Kids really are not very good at remembering that number, but we found that we could get them to the place where they could relax within the game and endorse these feelings of less anger by giving them the seed and letting them really play with it. It's a question of, to me on that level, you're asking, well, okay, can play, and then you're asking the second question of, well, okay, interrupt me if I'm not understanding you correctly. Can play really be a broad-based skill? Can play really transfer to beyond the scope of the game? And, to that, I honestly would point to my own evidence, which is we're putting kids in the game. We're not telling them how to interact with their mom. We're not telling them how to interact with their dad. We're not telling them how to interact with their teacher. We're not and we're seeing, in our first study, we're seeing kids endorse less feelings of anger and aggression outside of the game. In our second study, we're seeing parents say, I'm feeling less stressed. We're seeing parents say, my kid is less angry all the time. And we're seeing clinicians say, your symptoms are less severe. So, I think that, in that case, I don't even, there is literature about how transfer happens. But I think in our case, we're saying, well, if you support these pathways enough, then it goes to that step where I said these pathways become available for other skills in other situations and other stimulus to make use of. Okay, Mike is coming.
A quick question, then a longer question. So the quick question is, in the second study where you started seeing these effects, which was great, how many sessions did they have and over what?
10 sessions, once a week.
So it was 10 weeks?
Yep, 10 weeks, once a week.
Just
I think
once-
actually, and I actually want to just emphasize how little therapy this is considered in the world. When I talk to most audience, this is taken for granted, but 10 one-hour sessions spaced once a week is considered very, very little therapy. So to see these effects over that is something that surprised even me.
Now, I assume the parents and the other people who were rating didn't know what condition the kids were in.
Yes, they were blinded to whether,
And I hope the therapists also didn't know.
the therapist also did not know.
That's great. I'm sure you have thought about it, but are you going to look at the effects of the game alone without the therapy? I mean, you could, if you have different...
That's actually, yeah, that's one of the
Different
things that
wards,
I'm
you could just
really,
put
that's
it-
one of the things I'm really eager to do. So if you look at actually, thank you for alluding to the slide I have up there, but I really want to have the game, increasing the amount of practice that the kid gets. So the amount of time they spend in front of the game with sort of very little to eventually no therapy. I'm really curious about what skills this game can build, when you drastically reduce the amount of time you need in front of a therapist. These therapists are doing amazing work, but there's not really that many of them to go around, especially in the child world. So if we can help these kids build these skills, and then the therapist can focus on the more cognitive aspect, which is what they're really good at, the kid is just going to have all the more resources. I think, you're bringing up an excellent point. You eventually want to be able to withdraw really both scaffolds here. So you want to be able first to withdraw the therapist and see how that goes. And then after that, you want to be able to say, okay, well, you use the game for this period of time, and you want to slowly scale that back too and see if you can maintain gains after that too.
Okay, well, I got the mic. One last question. So heart rate seems good, but there's dozens of other measures you could also...
That's exactly right too. Heart rate is really convenient when a kid is not moving. The second you have a kid moving, you sort of run into all these challenges with heart rate, which when we're talking about the cars or even the blocks, it becomes a problem. So, getting information into our tools has actually been one of our, you're really good at alluding to this hardware, to this challenge slide. The hardware that we use has been an interesting, just a human factors problem and an interesting design problem. Heart rate sensors are surprisingly really, really finicky. As adults, I don't know if you guys are familiar. I run with a heart rate sensor. It works great. But I'm an adult. I have an adult build. It fits me well. I've made the tiniest little, I've built these tiny little, take the same sensor but tie it around kids. They just fall off. And I think it's just because kids are so little, it just falls off the kid all the time. And, what we actually collect heart rate with, I actually spend a lot of time working with, I still work with people from Tufts because that's where I have a supply of undergraduates from, but we spend a lot of time trying to build sensors that will actually work. We've used, I don't know if Rosalind Picard has spoken with this group, but her Q sensor is probably known to some of you guys. It's a galvanic skin response sensor. It measures how much you're sweating. And in a really controlled environment, those things are phenomenal. They're like magic. You can sort of watch you can watch in real time. It's a very fast response. We've put them on kids on our inpatient unit because we were just curious like what a kid's day looks like in terms of stress. We don't get any reading because the kid moves around and they're small, and like just how we build stuff for kids is, it's been quite the challenge of getting like this information out of a kid. I would generally say that if any of you guys have thoughts about that, please contact me afterwards. But you know, we spend time building stuff trying to get that. There's cool technology out there. You can get heart rate just by like the blood coming in out of your face. I don't know if you guys have seen this yet, but you know, cameras that you can just look at you. It's pretty sweet. But you know, there's lots of technology. Like we seem to be on the cusp of having like the right technology to do the job. But I actually never, when I started this project, I never envisioned myself being like a hardware engineer on the side. Got a question over there, Todd.
All right, so I have a pretty broad, like a broad two-parter.
Okay.
One, the first part is that what led you to study video games? Was it a certain kind of literature, or was it just in practice that you thought like that would be a good idea? And the second part was, do you hope that this this hypothesis or anything like that would lead to children maybe not needing as much medication? Maybe this process could help them solve the issue without being medicated?
Yeah, so let me tackle both of those. So what led us to study video games? Really, it was a matter of pragmatism. We know our kids, we know who's coming in, we know this audience, we know they're playing games. We know access to games is huge. We know eventually we can start to target all sorts of platforms that these kids are using. And you know, it really just straight out, like we know that like this is where our kids are, and we want to meet the kids where they are. I will say as an aside, we're often asked, and it's really a tangent to your question. We're often asked, you know, why we chose a shooting video game instead of, you know, a more peaceful video game, and it really comes back to, well, this is where our kids are. I mean, this is what they do, and we want to work with our kids. And we chose a pretty benign shooting metaphor, still, because you know we're sensitive, but only a little bit. And you know, the second question of where do we see this going? Do we see that? I certainly hope that we can reduce the reliance on medications. That's a really, the answer requires a little bit of nuance there, because medications do a lot of people a lot of good. And there are kids who need these medications. There are kids who have, you know, very serious conditions ranging from, you know, schizophrenia to a major depressive disorder that are going to benefit heavily from having the help that a medication can provide. That said, you don't have to wander that far to find even psychopharm people really worrying about overuse of medication. You know, I think that, you know, medication as an only intervention for a child medication is not going to teach a child any new skills. So our hope is that we can reduce the need for medication, where the medicine is a crutch, use it as a way to help withdraw the medication, and where we can reach the kids early enough and they have a disorder that takes on a life that doesn't necessarily demand medication, that we can completely avoid this situation. You know, sorry to couch that in so much nuance, but I also, you know, I mean, I work in a department of psychiatry. I'm really, really aware of the benefits that, you know, sometimes meds are the right course of action. All right, you know, that's the end. So ask away, and if not, thank you guys.
All right, are there any other questions, or did everyone get everything in during? All right, well, behind you and then.
As you mentioned, the kids like the games because it's a novel way to play. Is any of the commercial gaming companies trying to create games like this?
I think that, you know, I think that eventually we'll get there. I mean, in some ways, it's a bit of a niche. I mean, you know, kids, this is a vulnerable group of kids who, are not necessarily, well served or well understood. I mean, I think that one of the things, to go back to my, endorsement of teamwork
Sorry,
at the beginning.
kids that have anger control is a niche?
Well, yeah, I mean, I realize I'm probably talking to a room full of people with families. I understand that, but really taking a mental health and really taking a cognitive and neurological lens to the problem, I think is not something that people have really delved into. There is a Game for Change community. I don't really see, you guys probably are aware of the Games for Change community, and you're probably aware of the larger gaming world. You don't see EA doing a lot of work in the space of, let's do some social good with our game. So sadly, it's, I think that there's a lot to be done. And, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to show that there's some value there too. You got me wrong.
How did you get the baseline? Did you do that before each session?
Yeah, we do it before each session because the kids do move around a little bit. So we try to get the kids seated and relaxed, and that's how we define the baseline for each session.
And did you do it for like a minute and take the average?
Yeah, exactly. We take it for a minute, and we actually it's weighted towards the end. But yes.
Do you see other applications for this? I mean, one of the examples you said was ADHD. So that to me means somebody who has trouble
Right.
concentrating. And I'm just wondering if the
Right.
feedback the biofeedback can help them.
Yeah, well, so biofeedback in itself is not a new concept, and there are many applications for this. We're targeting the symptoms associated with a very particular, but very heavily used pathway in the brain, which is, your anxious, your angry response to, that happens when there's this disconnect between, or, this maladaptive connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. I think that, you see on the disorder spectrum, you see this there's a lot. You see it in anxiety, you see it in ADHD, you see it in, a little less so in depression, but you see it in depression. PTSD is a big one. Kids with autism, although that's usually comorbid anxiety with the kids with autism. But there are plenty of examples. And hopefully, it's a pretty broad-based approach because we're targeting a symptom that shows up in many disorders.
If I can make a comment, I'd love to put these in zip cars.
In zip cars?
Yeah, because some of our members are crazy.
Yeah, we could slow down the car. Let's stop it. That might be a little more dangerous on the highway.
So in the beginning, you were talking about very young kids, like 2 years old and 3 years old. But I think the first study was 10 years old.
Right.
And then you said you're trying to work with younger kids. Very young kids, of course, can play video games, but how young do you think you can go with this type of game?
That's something that I think about a lot. And the answer is, the answer will continue to emerge as, myself and other people do work in the field. With the video game, our initial threshold, based loosely on the various developmental levels that we know about kids, was that kids down to 10 would succeed in the video game. And that really, we were making various assumptions about ability to understand what's going on the screen, ability to control various things on the screen, and ability to make, generalizations about, well, if I do this effect within the computer environment will happen. The attempt to move to the toys was driven by the fact that one of the things that's well understood about as you move younger in kids is that they're very driven by their sense of self and their connection to an entire environment. So, it's one thing to have a virtual flat 2D environment in front of them, and it's a completely different matter to have like actual physical things that change behavior as you do that. So one of the things that, we are working with, we're working with kindergarten to get the blocks going. That's the research that's held up by this fact that heart rate monitors keep falling off kids. But, I would like to see the blocks, for example, used down to 4 and 5. I really rack my brain about how to get, because the part of the brain that does this it really starts to come online around the age of 2. And I haven't come up with a clever way to do this yet, but I would love to figure out a way to engage, essentially big toddlers about how to manipulate their environment, how to change things. And it's something that, I think is doable. I just don't have I haven't come up with the idea yet.
Next question over
Hi.
But a comment, I'd like to volunteer my kids for that. I have an 18-month-old. If you're looking for volunteers. But bigger question is, have you thought about from a behavioral platform perspective, like a lot of these gaming is going into behavior change platforms and combined with socially sharing it so that you're more involved, you're more aware of how you change, like if you look at any exercise and fitness things, like the Job On Up or Nike Plus.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and it's something that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's something that I've thought about, but not a lot. If that answers your question, I mean, it's something that I think that, the shared aspect of it and the platform aspect of it is a huge benefit, and I think that, we started out with a very narrow-minded focus on video game, like, we're going to make a video game and see if it does anything. But I think that, the ability to really know what your emotion is throughout the day and really be able to, really be able to turn that into a game in and of itself, and then do something with it and get rewards, I think is a really powerful idea. And I think it's something that, either we're going to work on or someone else is.
And if nobody else, right? Even
Yeah.
the parent or the supporting person behind
having
the
that
patient
information,
will
like,
be huge.
Well, even there's all sorts of applications you can think about it. Like, we deal with schools a lot in our, so if a teacher has access to how a kid is how a collection of kids are doing it during the day, I mean, one you can think about, well, just changes in curriculum and modifying curriculum, but you can also start to see well, okay, this person's about to blow up, let's put an intervention in place ahead of time before something, before the person gets out of control. And you see that negative feedback loop that I alluded to at the very beginning. You can cut it off at the pass.
Last question.
This is also more of a comment. I was just thinking of adult road rage and how games might put in this unconscious getting along with others on the road and slowing and, not getting the tickets and not getting the punishment.
I think you just found our Zipcar collaboration. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you guys. It was great.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.